And although there is no need to introduce our speakers because you have read their biographies, there is one thing you need to know. Anne had a cataract operation yesterday. And she is here today. And we can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for all the nice things. Don't worry about the spelling errors. I missed it also when I got to look at the program. Anyway, the name is spelled correctly up in front. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today, which is rather different from what you've heard so far, I'm going to talk about socialization, and particularly socialization of children. I am going to talk about and put some emphasis on the roles of thinking and feeling in the course of that socialization, because that's, of course, what the focus of today's activities is. Okay, what do I mean by socialization? Well, developmental psychologists usually think of it in terms of, or social psychologists, socialization is how experienced group members help newcomers to the group learn the values of that group. In other words, what are the important things that we want to do, the expected behavior, the beliefs, the attitudes. It happens whenever we enter a new group. So you switch jobs, and of course you have to know how to do this specific job. But you also need to know what the general culture, climate of this particular office or business or whatever it might be is. How do you deal with people? How do you interact? What's considered appropriate ways of doing things in this new group? Socialization occurs, well, one very important place it occurs is in immigration. So people come from a different country to wherever, their new place of residence where they intend to stay. Not only do they have to learn the language, but of course there's a lot of other learning that goes on when you immigrate to a new country. You have to learn, the attitudes, the expectations, the ways of doing things, and that's quite a challenge. Retirement, when you go from being getting paid for working to a more mature position in society where you have to learn what's appropriate. Okay. Most important socialization, however, occurs in the family, where children are prepared to become independent, to be able to go out into the world, to become independent, and where they acquire values such as concern for others, respect for others, a sense of responsibility. Now you see, put a note in here, see climate change discussion. This was the last time it really, very often it strikes me just how important socialization is in the family generally. And the last time I really got this feeling was in this very room about 3 weeks ago when there was a discussion of climate change and salary inequities. And it was very depressing because the bottom line essentially is we don't have very much time to save the planet, and politicians are never going to be able to do it. So this discussion went on. I'm getting sadder and sadder and more depressed. Somebody beside me seems to suggest they're feeling suicidal. What did I just touch? Oh, I don't want to touch. Okay, or I'll put my glasses on, my new glasses. Okay, thank you. Somebody sitting over in that general area stood up and said, the people who are going to solve the problems, thank you, the people who are going to solve the problems are the young people. They're the ones who are out marching, they're the ones who are organizing, They're the ones who take Friday afternoons off to protest cuts to the education system. And these are the people who are going to save the planet, or they're more likely to be able to save the planet. And they're the way they are because of the way they've been socialized in the family. Getting a bit thirsty. Just a final observation before I get really into the topic, and that is that thoughts, values are not necessarily linked to actual behavior. A psychologist, Shalom Schwartz, for example, has studied values across nations across the world. He and his colleagues are up to about 50 or 60 different nations. And what they find in every place, every country, every nation, is that benevolence and universalism, which translates into basically concern for others, social justice, respect for the environment is starting to creep into these. Every country lists them as the most important values. The least important, the values that are rated lowest, are power and achievement. And yet we know that not everybody behaves with respect to concern for others and social justice in a positive way, and that there are a lot of people who probably do value achievement and power. So what socialization, again, in the family does is to try and bring closer together what values are endorsed by society and the actual behavior of members of that society. Okay. Because parenting is the most important job there is, there's no shortage of a device. So if you type in parenting on a search engine, for example, you get roughly 260 million hits, which is a lot of reading, even if you're retired. If you look for books on parenting, there are 42 at last count, and I think it changes every day. There were 42,000 books on the topic. So there's no dearth of interest. There are some problems, however, with all this information. First of all, the advice is really unorganized. So I just picked out a few titles of books or blogs or whatever that had numbers in them. So there's 20 tips for parents, and there are 25 scientific tips. 10 commandments, clever. 50 easy ways to be a fantastic parent, if you could only remember what the 50 ways are. So try to put it all together in some kind of comprehensive fashion is rather difficult. More important even, however, is that the advice for teaching values is confusing and contradictory. It's so confusing and contradictory that every once in a while you read someone saying, let's forget the experts, they don't know what they're talking about, or just do what feels good. So you read on one hand, you should be sensitive and responsive to your child's wishes and willing to compromise. But you need to set rules and make sure they're consistently followed, so don't compromise. Respond to crying so your baby will be securely attached. But don't respond to crying or you'll reinforce it. Reward your child for good behavior, but don't reward your child because that will undermine intrinsic motivation. And never spank your child, but spanking can be useful. Okay, so is there a solution to this? Well, I think I might have a possible suggestion. So what I've been looking at and thinking about along with my students and former students is that it helps to take, or might help to take, a domain approach to socialization. Instead of a one item response for everything, let's look at socialization as occurring in different domains. So children operate in different domains, or they participate in different kinds of social interaction. And parenting needs to be geared to the domain that they're currently in. So what I'm going to do is run through, if you look through the research literature, which I assure you is substantial in this case, there are at least 5 areas in which parents have been shown to help children learn values and attitudes. And there are different cognitions and different emotions that are associated with each of these domains. All right, the first domain is the protection domain. When is it operative? When is a child in the protection domain? Well, this happens when the child feels unsafe or anxious, in danger, upset, distressed in some way. This is what goes on in the protection domain. What does the parent do in that domain? What is the appropriate response when a child is distressed and upset? Well, the first is to alleviate the child's distress, comfort the child. Next comes helping the child learn to deal with distress on their own. So this is coping. You don't just always comfort. You hand over some of the responsibility for comforting to the child. Behavior in the protection domain also provides a good example of how to behave with others who are in distress. So this is where you learn how to care for or to comfort other people. What is the nature of the relationship between parent and child in this domain? Well, the parent is the provider, the caregiver, and the child is the recipient of that care. What thoughts and emotions, okay, as promised. In the protection domain, if parenting has been successful, then children learn to believe that others are there for them and will care for them. They learn to trust people. They learn to trust their parents, for example, not to ask them to do unreasonable things. They learn to cope. They learn to think their way out of particular situations. There are 3 emotions that are prominent in the protection domain, and the first is empathy. So this is where, and it starts very early, this is where observing distress in other people activates neural circuits in the self, so that the observer watching someone else in distress experiences that same kind of distress and helps the other person or comforts the other person at the same time, essentially, as they're comforting themselves. Sympathy is another reaction, and this comes as cognitive capacities increase to some extent, so that you don't necessarily feel the same emotion as the other person, but you do feel sadness for someone else's distress, and that is a motivator, again, for pro-social or helping behavior. The bad one is personal distress. This happens when the child hasn't really been adequately socialized in the protection domain, where they haven't learned to cope. And so they feel overwhelming sadness at the plight of another person, and all that does is motivate wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible, so that if escape is a possibility, then you're not going to get very much pro-social behavior in that area. So those are the thoughts and emotions in the protection domain. It's empathy and sympathy start very early. And this is something that developmental psychologists, I guess, have gotten particularly interested in the last 4 or 5 years, is just how early you see babies distressed when they see somebody else distressed and comforting them. I mean, look, these are about 4, 5, 6-month-old babies, and they're comforting their fellow children, babies. Okay, next domain. Better watch the time here. Humans have evolved to reciprocate favors. I do something for you, you do something for me. This is an important exchange relationship. We also keep track so that if I've done you a few favors and I haven't had too many back from you, I'm going to quit giving you favors, right? Same thing happens in socialization, in the family, in the reciprocity domain. So the child is in the reciprocity domain when he or she asks for something reasonable, like could we play this game for a few minutes? It's got to be reasonable, but the parent action is, when possible and when reasonable, it would be good to comply with those reasonable requests because the result is a positive one, and that is the child reciprocates. And the next time the child is asked to do something, for example, they'll be much more likely to go along with it because they are in this situation of reciprocity. The relationship here is one between equals. It's an exchange relationship. It's not this caregiver, child in distress situation. Now we've moved into a new domain where parent and child are equals. Thoughts and emotions in the reciprocity domain. Well, here, basically, this is encouraging the development of an attitude towards being asked to do things or asked to comply, where compliance is willingly given, freely given, no second thoughts about it, as opposed to situations where it's forced, where you do it because if you don't, you're going to get into trouble, or your mother's going to keep nagging you, or your father's going to threaten something. So the basic thought here, the important thought here, is that compliance is willingly given. It's a happy domain. It's not like the protection domain. This is the domain of play, of pleasure, joy, happiness, except for sometimes parents where it's boring. So here's a review of a book called All Joy and No Fun. Over and over again, I find myself bored by what I'm doing with my children. How many times can we read Angelina Ballerina or watch a Bob the Builder video? And yet I remind myself that such intimate shared moments, snuggling close, provide the ultimate meaning of life. If I lost all of my emails, that's not a problem. But if I lost my children, I'd never recover. Yet still, I sometimes find it hard to stay in the moment with them. Perfectly understandable. Third domain, control domain. This is the one that actually probably attracts the most concern on the part of teachers and on the part of parents. What do you do when a child has behaved badly? Well, the parent action is to set rules so that they're very clear, and to use appropriate discipline when misdeeds occur. So what is it, appropriate discipline? It's a kind of combination of knowing and experiencing the consequences of your behavior, but also understanding why your behavior was not acceptable. So the kind of punishment catches the child's attention, as it were, so that they're now capable of listening to and understanding reasoning. And reasoning has to be fair, it has to be appropriate, the punishment should be appropriate to the deed. So all these things have to be fine-tuned. What's the relationship in the control domain? It's one of authority. The parent is the boss, controls a lot of resources, and the child is the person who has to toe the line. Thoughts and emotions in the control domain. Here again, we come at this whole notion of doing something willingly. So in this case, children, for example, one way of looking at it is to say that children make attributions. Why did I behave in this particular way? And if your explanation for your behavior is because I knew I'd be grounded for 3 weeks if I didn't do it, this isn't very good. Whereas if your explanation is because that's really the right way to do things and it's not nice to offend or hurt other people. So it's the difference between external attributions and making attributions to internal factors and understanding that a decision came from you and was not forced on you from outside. Whoops. Help. Moral emotions. Empathic guilt is the big one. If you look at all the research literature in control, this is one that comes up most often, and that is that if children feel guilty because they've harmed somebody else, if you feel guilty first because for some kind of I'm ashamed sort of reason, that's not effective. But if it's the knowledge that you have harmed others that is aroused in a situation, then that moral emotion of empathic guilt is probably going to keep you less likely to deviate again. There are lots of emotions floating around in the control domain. Fear of punishment is one obvious one. Anger that you can't do what you want to do. Frustration that you can't do what you want to do. Reactance is one that often comes up. Essentially, I'm going to do the opposite of what you want me to do because I'm angry, because I feel that I'm being controlled. I don't understand why I have to do these things. So reactance is one particularly negative outcome. Guided learning. This happens independent of what the child does, but it involves a teaching moment when an occasion arises. So you're walking down the street and you see a homeless man lying in the doorway. That could be an opportunity to teach, to talk about, not preach about, but to talk in an exchange kind of way with the child about the issue of homelessness and what can be done about it and what do we owe other people who are less fortunate than ourselves. So this is really a notion from cognitive psychology in terms of how teaching should be accomplished and how skills and knowledge can be developed in the child, but it works very well in the domain of social teaching as well. And the important thing is the parent is here and the child is there. And it's to get the child up to or internalizing the parent's position. And the way you do that is you start down just at the top of the child's ability to understand or think, and you scaffold your way. The two terms, zone of proximal development, where the child is, and thank you, and you scaffold up. So the child eventually comes to see things the same way as the parent. The relationship here is teacher and student. Thoughts and emotions in the guided learning domain. Again, it's a slightly different kind of internalization from not doing something because you'll feel guilty because you hurt another person. This one is really, this is the appropriate and reasonable way to act. And it has to be, really need to underline the fact, that it has to involve a back and forth. It can't be preachy. It has to involve reflection and questioning and listening to the child's point of view. Pleasure, basically, is the emotion. We don't have all these other negative emotions in this particular domain. The last domain, observation and group participation. When is the child in this domain? All the time. We want to be like members of the in-group. We behave like members of the in-group. And children want to be like other kids, and they want to be like their parents. They want to, be able to drive cars and clean houses, and there's a lot of that kind of activity that is generated by this desire simply to be part of the in-group. So what parents need to do here is expose their children to positive models, get them involved in routine activities that are pro-social in nature, and rituals. This is just what we automatically do. So there's no thought. This is just part of being the group. Sometimes it's called observation with intent to participate. In other words, and this is more a technique of learning in other cultures, I guess, is where small children watch adults doing things with the knowledge that they themselves are going to subsequently do it. Thoughts and emotions. Again, this is internalization. This is yet another form of internalization. This is taking over the values of the in-group because you want to be a member of the in-group. There's a feeling of group belonging, and again, it's a feeling of pleasure. Here's an example. These are kids, for example, who presumably, volunteer activity is one important thing that in our culture. In Ontario, every student has to put in X hours of volunteer work in the year. And this actually works. This makes them more pro-social and more inclined to get involved in things like climate change. So here are a bunch of teenagers cleaning up the street. They're together. There's group pleasure in what they're doing, and they're engaging in pro-social activity. They've internalized this particular value. I like this one. It's the night watch. It's all those guys getting together, drinking, carousing, having a great time, because they're about to set out on a dangerous mission, which is patrolling the streets of Amsterdam and protecting all the citizens. So there's a camaraderie there, which is very exciting for the people who take part in it, and very good for the internalization of pro-social values. Okay, why did the child behave badly? They were upset in the protection domain. There hasn't been an exchange relationship built up in the reciprocity domain. They know better, but they hope to avoid discipline. They needed to learn about a particular value, that's guided learning, and they're hanging out with bad people, playing too many violent video games, watching too much violent television. And this is where parents need to intervene and say enough. I think yes, I have 20 seconds, so I will just say at this moment, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Joan. Much appreciated. So we have time for discussion.
Thank you very much for this talk, and I really like this idea of sort of domain specificity of when you should respond in what kind of a way. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, it almost feels like it's pushing back one step, how to decide how to respond, because now what it means is we have to identify what domain we're in, right? Am I in the domain where it's better just to comfort this child, or am I in the domain? So I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about recognizing that.
I think where you're taking us or yourself as well is that often there's more than one domain operating. And so it's easy enough if you've got a child who just fell and skinned his knee, but what if he fell and skinned his knee and then kicked his brother who had pushed him in the first place? So I think that how you deal with the control problem is going to be a little different. First of all, you're going to comfort, because that's what started the whole thing. And then you're going to say, but, and let's see if we can think of a better way to deal with it. So I think that's one good example of where more than one domain is operative. Guided learning is up to a parent. So you're walking along the street and nothing in particular has happened, but you see a great opportunity. Again, why I'm just trying to think of what could be happening at the same time as you realize your child is not behaving well. It could be because they know better, but it also could be because they don't like their friends. So you would really want to operate in both domains. So yeah, that's, it's not as neat and clean in that sense, but I think you can still at least identify the domains. We have, for the last several years in my lab, we've collected the narratives from students about a time when they learned an important value. And so it's actually quite easy to kind of slot their memories. I don't know whether that's really what happened, but this is what they took away with themselves. It's easy to slot these stories into different domains.
We're back here.
Okay. I've been curious about the long-range effects of changes in child rearing. I have a personal hypothesis, which may be a little exaggerated, but I'd like your response to it. And that is that one of the other things that troubles me is the deep divide in many of our systems. It's not just in the it's more visible in the United States because of Trump, but it exists in Canada to a lesser degree. It exists in many European countries where the divide is no longer about religion or ethnicity. It's about a basic divide in cultural values. And I see the divide in North America as partly the result of what I call the Dr. Spock revolution, the fact that we raised our kids differently from the way our parents did. And our children, but this isn't the whole society, our children are I don't know how to describe it, more progressive in their approach to child rearing than we were. My two daughters never spanked or even slapped the hands, or they never used physical pressure at all, and yet they raised all the fears of right-wing groups about child rearing didn't play out. They raised three wonderful children, etc. And I wonder if you could comment on the effects, the long-range effects of changes in child rearing.
Well, this is part of what leads to all that discrepant advice. Responsive to your child under every condition. don't be responsive, set rules. And I think it becomes a matter of the labels that you put on these things. One thing that I think that is important across the board, no matter what century you live in or what decade you live in, is acceptance of the child, caring and loving. And in that context, you can do a lot of other things. Are we turning kids out who are better these days? Or worse? Or the same? And I think that may be in part having to do with the underlying nature of the relationship. Is it a secure one? Is it a caring one? And within that context, you then make a decision about what to do. It's not a very good answer to your question. I think that one of the things that I like about the domain approach is that it kind of covers no matter what century or decade you're in. It gives you some guidance, whereas as our notions change, we're probably putting more emphasis on one domain than we are on another.
Since in this room, most people have grandchildren rather than children, not everybody, but a lot of us, I just wondered, how do you see the grandparents' role in the socialization of children?
Keep your mouth shut. I think it isn't acceptable in our culture. In others it is. Grandparents are very active in looking after their children. In our culture, not so much. I just read something in the paper the other day, someone writing for advice, a grandparent had seen her daughter-in-law doing something she didn't like, and the question was, should she speak to the daughter-in-law about this? And the advice was not to speak to the daughter-in-law, but just to go after the kid and say, you know, let's go for a ice cream cone and chat and deal with it that way. So I think grandparents just provide love and acceptance. It's easier.
I have a question that's related to the one that was asked about generational differences, which is cultural context. So at a time when I read a lot of this work as a graduate student, there were studies of child rearing in Germany versus the United States, and children were being raised very differently, but all coming out okay as well-adjusted humans, so that a parenting behavior that was just the norm in Germany would have been considered too controlling in the United States, but both were successful within that cultural context. So that's just an example to ask you to talk about how all of this interacts with kind of the cultural expectations surrounding the parent.
You've put your finger on a very important thing in this. We're socializing for membership in a particular group. So what's acceptable in Germany may be seen as less acceptable in terms of interactions. Japan, the relationship between child and mother is very different and closer, and the whole idea is to draw your child towards you, whereas in Western European culture, it's to prepare the child to go out and to become relatively, at least, autonomous. So, but I still come back. I think the domains still handle that, because it tells you that this is how you would expect people in the culture that I'm preparing you to participate, and this is how we do it.
Well, the mic's right here, and then I'll go over there.
Okay, a quick question. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I have a feeling that you largely used the context of a comfortable society such as ours, the one we know, or Western Europe and so forth. I wonder if you could comment on the situation of extreme violence that we see a lot of, such as Yemen or the Rohingya refugees and so on and so forth. What of these ideas can you generalize to take in those situations, and what is different? I would imagine that in such a situation, the parent's first duty would be to take the child into relative safety, basic needs like food and a blanket and so forth. But then, how would some of these ideas apply even in those extreme situations?
Well, as you were speaking, and I was also thinking, of course, that I haven't said anything about parents, and parents have thoughts and emotions as well. And that in the countries, examples that you're providing where there's a lot of violence and terrible things are happening, this is having an effect on parents. So that's making the child rearing situation even more challenging. But I guess that's a bit of an aside. There's been quite a bit of research on children from war-torn countries, and I haven't kept up with it in order to really tell you what the latest is. I think comfort. I'm working with a Syrian family at the moment, just conversation-wise, but I mean, they have two 12-year-old twin sons, and these guys still don't want to be left alone. You can change some of this through therapeutic intervention, through more positive kinds of experiences, but it's hard to overcome. I think, I think you still need to set rules and expectations. You still need trust. You still need acceptance and love. You still try to protect your child from seeing bad things as much as you possibly can. So I think you could get some useful guidance from thinking still in terms of these different domains.
A lot of parents today have caregivers that take care of their children because, financial responsibilities. They're both working. They have a housekeeper that takes care of the kids, brings them up. Basically, they are raising the children. Okay, when they come home, these parents are stressed out. They've only got a limited time to spend with them. How do you think that's affecting the children that are growing up today?
Well, stress is a big problem, isn't it? Stress is when your child asks you, let's play a game, and you say, I can't now because I've got 1,000 things to do. All I can say is I think it's unfortunate that raising children successfully does require some effort. I think that if you can avoid, I always think of good behavior, positive parenting behavior in the protection domain at least, and in the guided learning and group participation, you avoid a lot of trouble in the control domain. That's the really bad one. That's the really stressful one. So if we can start to think about some of these other areas as other ways of inculcating concern for others and pro-social values, then maybe stress, we reduce our own stress, but it takes some effort.
Thank you very, very much indeed. You have clearly been